It begins the way so many modern myths begin, not in a laboratory, not in a temple, but on a screen. A cursor blinks, a username appears, and somewhere behind the glow of midnight monitors, a stranger claims he is not where he belongs in time. We live in an age that distrusts certainty. The past is revised with every new archive. The present shifts under our feet, and the future arrives faster than our language can describe it. In that kind of world, time travel stops being just a fantasy of machines and lightning bolts. It becomes a metaphor for something quieter and more human. The feeling that history is never really gone, and tomorrow is always leaking into today. But what if the metaphor occasionally becomes literal? Across centuries, scattered like shells on a long shoreline, there are stories that refuse to settle. A man steps into a city and carries the wrong decade in his pockets. Two scholars walk through a garden and feel the air thicken, as if they've wandered into a page that hasn't turned yet. A corroded device rises from a shipwreck, packed with gears that seem to belong to a much later world. A figure in old film footage holds a small, dark object to her ear, with a gesture so familiar it feels almost personal, like watching a memory you haven't lived. Most of these accounts are impossible to prove and easy to dismiss. That is part of their power. They sit at the edge of our confidence, asking a question science respects more than any answer. What exactly do we think time is? We talk about time like it's a straight road. Past behind us, future ahead, present as the thin line we balance on. Yet physics has always whispered that this neat picture might be a convenience, not a truth. Relativity bends time. Gravity slows it. Motion stretches it. At the smallest scales, the universe behaves like a riddle. Meanwhile, the mind, our own inner instrument, replays, rewrites, and reshapes experience until yesterday can feel sharper than this morning. So when someone claims to have slipped free of the calendar, we're forced to weigh two mysteries at once: the strange behavior of reality and the strange behavior of us. This story isn't a courtroom, and it isn't a confession booth. We won't treat every claim as fact, and we won't mock them as delusion. We'll do something harder and perhaps more honest. We'll listen the way a careful historian listens and the way a curious human listens. We'll hold the evidence up to the light, notice where it gleams, and admit where it fades into shadow. We'll ask what these accounts reveal about culture, about technology, about fear, and about hope. And we'll keep returning to the same quiet tension, discovery versus doubt, because that tension is where real understanding is born. There is a reason time travel endures. It isn't only the thrill of changing history or seeing what comes next. It's the longing underneath, to rescue something lost, to undo a mistake, to find proof that our choices matter in a universe that feels too vast. Time travel stories are often about control, but they're also about vulnerability. They confess that we are temporary creatures trying to make permanent meaning. Tonight, consider a different possibility. Maybe the question isn't whether someone truly crossed the decades like a river. Maybe the deeper question is why we keep returning to the riverbank, staring at the water, certain we've seen something move beneath the surface. If time is not as simple as we assume, if it is a landscape instead of a line, then what does that make us? Travelers, witnesses, or just storytellers standing in the present, trying to touch both ends of our own lives? What if the first true time traveler didn't arrive in a flash of light, but in a chat window, typing like any other stranger, asking for nothing but to be believed? In the late nights of the year 2000, when the internet still felt like a frontier town built out of dial-up tones and anonymous handles, a new voice appeared on message boards. He didn't sound like a poet or a prophet. He sounded like someone trained to report facts, coordinates, equipment, procedures. He called himself John Titor. At first, the claim was almost modest in its way. He said he was a soldier from the year 2036, sent back to retrieve a specific computer, an IBM 5100, because it could solve a problem his era couldn't easily untangle. The detail wasn't cinematic, it was bureaucratic. That's what unsettled people. He wasn't promising lottery numbers or miracles. He was describing a mission, like a mechanic explaining why a certain wrench mattered. Then came the machinery. Titor posted diagrams and explanations of a time displacement device. He described it as something engineered, serviced, and mounted into an ordinary vehicle. First a sports car, later a larger truck or SUV for practical reasons. He talked about gravitational distortion, micro-singularities, and the idea that traveling through time might not mean sliding along a single timeline, but branching into neighboring versions of reality. Not a single river, but a delta. Skeptics saw science fiction cosplay. Believers saw something else, a strange competence. His language had the clipped certainty of someone used to manuals. He didn't ask for money. He didn't build a cult. He simply answered questions, sometimes patiently, sometimes with irritation that felt oddly real. And then, inevitably, people asked about the future. Titor offered predictions, but not in the way fortune-tellers do. He didn't paint utopias. He described a world that had bruised itself. He warned of social fracture, of conflict, of systems failing under their own weight. Some details were specific enough to be eerie, others broad enough to fit many outcomes. The internet, as it always does, began to sort his words into two piles, what seemed to land and what didn't. Years passed. Some of his statements looked clever in hindsight. Observations about technology shrinking and becoming intimate, about networks tying the world together while making it lonelier, about the way fear and certainty could be weaponized. Other predictions failed to arrive on schedule or arrived in forms no one could fairly grade. That's the trouble with prophecy. Reality rarely honors our deadlines. And yet the story didn't die, because the core mystery wasn't whether he guessed right. It was why he sounded the way he sounded, why the account was so textured, why the explanations were delivered with the unromantic tone of someone describing a generator, not a miracle, why he kept returning to the same point, that time travel, if it existed at all, might not rewrite our past like an eraser, but simply place you into a slightly different strand of it. In that framework, even the wrong predictions become harder to dismiss. A branching universe doesn't promise the traveler's future will become our future. It only suggests that the traveler came from somewhere close enough to recognize, like seeing your own face in a window and realizing the glass belongs to another building. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, John Titor vanished from the forums. No farewell, no final revelation, just silence, like a radio losing signal as a car drives into a tunnel. Maybe it was an elaborate performance, stitched together by a clever mind hungry for attention but disciplined enough to avoid profit. Maybe it was a hoax that accidentally mirrored real theories because the internet can turn raw ideas into convincing costumes. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something rarer. A brief contact with a traveler who didn't come to change history, only to borrow a tool, complete a task, and return to a world we'll never see. If time is a maze of branching corridors, then what does it mean to predict anything at all? And how many futures are speaking through the same blinking cursor? Before we follow any traveler further, we should pause at a quieter doorway, one that isn't made of metal or mathematics, but of memory. Because long before message boards and diagrams, people were already slipping in and out of time without moving an inch. You've felt it, even if you never named it. A smell in the air, rain on hot pavement, a certain kind of soap suddenly pulls you into another year. You aren't thinking about the past, you're standing inside it. Your body reacts before your mind catches up. Your heart moves to an older rhythm. And for a few seconds, the present becomes a thin film stretched over something deeper. If time travel has a natural habitat, it might be that moment. Historians understand this better than most. They don't merely collect dates, they reconstruct worlds. When they hold a letter, they feel the pressure of another person's day. When they read a ship's log, they hear wind in rigging and taste salt. The past becomes tactile, not because the historian is delusional, but because human consciousness is designed to make reality out of fragments. And so any story about time travel has to wrestle with the most difficult truth. The brain is already a machine for leaving the present. That doesn't mean every claim is false. It means every claim begins on slippery ground. When people report meeting someone out of place in time, it often comes with a feeling rather than proof. An accent that doesn't belong, manners that feel too formal, clothing that looks like a costume until you notice the stitching is wrong for modern replicas. The accounts can feel vivid because they're filtered through shock, the kind that burns details into the mind. Yet shock also makes us unreliable. It turns the world into a spotlight with a wide shadow, leaving us to fill in gaps with what we expect. Still, some stories persist because they carry friction. They catch on the imagination not as smooth legends, but as questions with sharp edges. They include a name that can be traced, a location that can be visited, a description that doesn't fit the usual template of rumor. One such story begins not with a machine, but with a man who steps into a crowd like a single wrong note in a familiar song. A stranger appears in a city, speaking a language no one recognizes, carrying papers that seem official, yet belong to no known government. His clothing is strange, his luggage unfamiliar. He doesn't behave like a prankster. He behaves like a person who is confused, then afraid, then furious that the world has shifted around him without permission. It's the kind of tale that tempts the mind to extremes. Either it's a perfect hoax or it's a crack in reality. But there is another possibility that feels almost more unsettling, that the story is a mirror, reflecting how easily the human world can misfile a person. A traveler from a distant place can be mistaken for a traveler from a distant time. A misunderstanding becomes a myth. A myth becomes a brand. And the longer it's retold, the more it grows into the shape we want, because we're hungry for proof that time is permeable. This is the rhythm we'll return to again and again. The push of wonder, the pull of doubt, evidence and yearning intertwined. So as we move into the next chapter, into a case that looks, at first glance, like a genuine rupture, we carry a simple rule. We will not rush. We will not sneer. We will ask, what do we know? What do we only feel? And what does this story reveal about the era that told it? Because sometimes the real mystery isn't whether someone traveled through time. It's why we needed them to. If the past can reach into us with the force of a living thing, then where does the boundary truly sit between memory, myth, and reality? On a warm Thursday evening in June of 1950, Times Square was doing what it always does, swallowing people into its bright, restless current. Neon washed the sidewalks, horns argued with one another, feet moved in practiced dodges between tourists and commuters. The city felt modern, electric, confident in its own momentum. And then, for a brief moment, the rhythm broke. Witnesses later described a man stepping off the curb as if the street itself had surprised him. He looked around with the startled attention of someone waking in a place he didn't recognize. Not drunk, not reckless, just disoriented, like the world had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. A taxi struck him. The impact was immediate. The crowd reacted the way crowds always do. Gasps, shouts, hands to mouths, strangers suddenly linked by shock. The police arrived. An ambulance came too late. Another anonymous tragedy, filed into the endless ledger of a city that rarely pauses. Until they searched his pockets, the man was dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to another century. A dark frock coat, buttoned shoes, the kind of tailoring you'd expect in sepia photographs. Yet the fabric looked clean and new, not like costume wear. It wasn't distressed, it wasn't aged, and it didn't carry the weary softness of something that had survived decades in a trunk. His wallet held identification, but it didn't connect him to the year 1950. It connected him to a name, Rudolph Fentz. And alongside that name, money that was no longer in circulation, brass items that looked old enough to be antiques, and a token said to be redeemable at a tavern that no longer existed. None of it made sense in the plain, practical way that police work prefers. A person can lie, but objects are harder to teach new stories. A man can claim anything, but why would he carry the kind of artifacts that require research to even recognize? The case moved from ordinary to uncanny when investigators dug into records. In missing person files dating back to the late 19th century, there was an entry for a man with the same name, Rudolph Fentz, who had vanished without a trace during an evening walk. The description, according to the legend, matched the accident victim in troubling detail. And then a second echo, a later directory listing for a Rudolph Fentz Jr., who, when contacted, reportedly claimed his father had disappeared decades earlier under mysterious circumstances. A photograph was offered. The face, they said, was the same. If the story stopped there, it would already be enough to haunt. A man steps out of an earlier era, blinks in the glare of a new century, and dies before he can understand what's happened. No grand mission, no heroic arc, just a human being caught in the wrong chapter. But the real power of the Rudolph Fentz tale is the way it forces two uncomfortable questions to sit side by side. First, could a person truly be displaced in time, dropped into the future like a letter delivered to the wrong address? Second, even if the story is exaggerated, embellished, or misremembered, why does it persist so stubbornly? Maybe because it is the purest form of the time travel fear. Not the fantasy of controlling history, but the terror of being controlled by it. To arrive in a world where everything you know is obsolete, where your currency is meaningless, where the names of streets have changed, where even the air feels different. Whether Rudolph Fentz was a genuine anomaly, a clever fabrication, or a rumor that grew teeth over time, the emotional truth remains razor-sharp. We are all, in a way, one wrong step away from feeling out of time. We sense it when technology outpaces our comfort, when culture shifts its vocabulary, when the future shows up in our living rooms and speaks in a language we didn't learn. And that is why this story lingers in the mind. Not because it proves time travel, but because it dramatizes something deeply human, the fragility of belonging. If a single misstep can make a person a stranger to his own world, then how secure is any moment we call now? It's one thing to imagine time travel as a mechanical problem, gears, equations, a device that hums and strains against physics. It's another to stumble into it while walking through a garden. In the summer of 1901, two English academics, women trained to observe, categorize, and question, took a trip to France. Their destination was Versailles, the palace whose grandeur had become, by then, a kind of monument to vanished power. Visitors wandered its halls like pilgrims in a museum of lost certainty. They were not searching for mysteries. They were searching for sunlight, architecture, the feeling of stepping through history in the ordinary way we all do, as tourists. And then, somewhere near the gardens, the air changed. The story, as it has been passed down, is both simple and unsettling. The women described becoming disoriented, as if the familiar order of paths and landmarks had quietly rearranged itself. The mood of the place shifted, less like a public site, more like private grounds. They noticed figures in old-fashioned dress, not reenactors, not performers calling attention to themselves, but people behaving naturally, as if their clothing was not a costume, but the skin of their era. The details in their account are the kind that cling to the mind. A man with a pockmarked face seated nearby. Another figure wearing a long cloak. An atmosphere that felt heavy, almost muffled, as if sound itself had been absorbed by a different century. One of the women later reported seeing a lady sketching, dressed in a style that suggested the late 18th century. The scene was calm, domestic, strangely intimate, like glimpsing through a curtain into someone else's afternoon. And then, just as abruptly, the moment broke. The garden returned to its ordinary present. Modern visitors reappeared, the light shifted back into the familiar. The two women, shaken, walked away with the uneasy sense that they had not simply imagined something, but crossed a threshold they couldn't name. Years later, they published their experience. That act alone was daring. Educated society, especially in that era, did not reward women for telling stories that sounded impossible. They framed their account carefully, aware of skepticism, trying to hold to what they believed they had perceived. And yet, once their story was released into the world, it became a mirror that reflected whatever the reader carried in. For believers, it was a time slip, a temporary overlap between eras, like two radio stations bleeding into each other. For skeptics, it was a psychological phenomenon, suggestion, confusion, the power of expectation in a place saturated with history. The women may have misread the layout, encountered a private event, or let their minds stitch a narrative from scattered cues. But the case refuses to settle because both interpretations leave something unresolved. If it was a mistake, why did it feel so coherent? Why did it present not as a dreamlike blur, but as a structured scene, people, clothing, posture, mood, complete with the ordinary textures of life? And if it was not a mistake, what does that imply about time? Maybe time is less like a hard wall and more like layered fabric. Most days, we move along the top layer and never feel what lies beneath. But occasionally, through coincidence, environment, or some unknown condition, the layers press together and you catch the warmth of another moment through the cloth. There is also a third possibility, one that feels almost too gentle to be called an explanation, that places can store impressions. Not in a supernatural way, but in the way certain landscapes preserve footprints long after the body has gone. The brain arrives at Versailles already filled with images, paintings, books, postcards, films. The mind is primed, and in that primed state, perception becomes a kind of collaboration between the world and our inner archive. Whether these women witnessed an authentic overlap or a human mind doing what it does best, building meaning from fragments, the story carries a quiet truth. The past is not dead in places like this. It sits close. It waits in the geometry of paths and the angle of sunlight on stone. So the question becomes less about proof and more about intimacy. How near is history, really? And what happens to us when we feel it breathing beside our own time? Some mysteries don't begin with a person. They begin with an object, heavy in the hand, cold to the touch, stubbornly real. If you want to understand why time travel stories endure, look at what survives us. Not legends, not memories, things. A gear does not care what century it's in. A lens will still bend light. A sequence of precisely cut teeth will still mesh with another. Objects carry their own logic, and that logic can outlive every human explanation surrounding it. In the early 20th century, divers exploring a shipwreck off the coast of Greece recovered a corroded mass that looked like little more than ancient scrap. It was hauled up with statues and pottery, another artifact destined for storage, another curiosity from the seabed. But then someone noticed the gears. Inside the encrusted lump were interlocking wheels, arranged with purpose, not decorative, not random, mechanical, the kind of internal architecture you'd expect in a clock, yet the object had been lying underwater for roughly 2,000 years. As researchers cleaned and studied it, the artifact became harder to name. It wasn't just a collection of gears, it seemed to be a machine designed to calculate, to predict, to model cycles in the sky. A kind of analog computer, not the sleek silicon logic of modern devices, but a brass and bronze intelligence built from rotation and ratio. And with that realization, time itself shifted, because the world had long assumed that certain kinds of technological sophistication belonged to certain eras. The past, in our imagination, is often simpler than it truly was. We smooth it into a story of gradual ascent, crude tools, then better tools, then genius, then us. But the device from the shipwreck suggested something else, that human ingenuity has always arrived in waves, that brilliance appears, disappears, and sometimes sinks, literally into silence. No one needed to invoke literal time travel to feel the tremor this object sent through modern confidence. The tremor came from a different question. If such complexity existed, then what else did? What knowledge was lost? What designs were sketched and never copied? What workshops burned? What libraries dissolved? What apprentices died before they could pass their craft forward? In that sense, the artifact is a kind of time traveler itself, not because it moved through time intentionally, but because it survived the brutal selection process of history. It crossed centuries, not by bending physics, but by escaping destruction. And this is where the narrative takes a turn. Because many of the most compelling time travel mysteries may not be about people displaced into the future. They may be about progress displaced into the past, about inventions arriving earlier than our tidy timelines allow, then vanishing before they can become the foundation for the next age. When we encounter something like that, we feel the same emotion we feel when hearing a traveler's claim, a mix of awe and vertigo. The sense that the story we've told ourselves about time, linear, steady, predictable, may be a comfort, not a truth. The artifact's gears also raise another haunting thought. A machine like this does not appear from nothing. It implies a tradition, a community of minds, a chain of knowledge where one person refines what another began. For every surviving device, There were likely prototypes, failures, experiments, and conversations now erased. So perhaps the time traveler is not a person at all, but human intelligence itself, jumping forward in brief sparks, then being dragged back by war, collapse, plague, or simple neglect. The future doesn't always wait for the past to catch up. Sometimes it appears early, shines for a moment, and then goes dark. That is a kind of tragedy we recognize, even in our own era. We see brilliant ideas abandoned because funding dries up, because attention shifts, because the world moves on. We lose things not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. And later generations call them ahead of their time, as if time were a judge handing down verdicts. What if, instead, time is just the arena, and we are the ones who keep misplacing the tools? If an ancient machine can feel like a message from the future, then how many futures have already happened, quietly, in the past, and slipped away before we learned their names? A photograph can feel like a trapdoor. One moment you're looking at history, grainy faces, old coats, streets that seem narrower than they should be. The next moment, something in the frame catches your eye, and the past stops behaving like the past. It's usually something small, a detail, a posture, an object held in a hand. And then your mind does what it always does when it encounters the unfamiliar. It reaches for the nearest modern explanation. In one widely circulated claim, an old image appears to show a person dressed in early 20th century clothing, standing among a crowd, holding something that looks eerily like a modern phone. In another, a woman in footage from the 1920s walks briskly with a dark object pressed to her ear, her mouth moving as if she's speaking. The gesture is so ordinary to us, so deeply trained by contemporary life, that it feels like a glitch in time. You watch it and think reflexively, she's on a call. These moments spread because they are perfect for the modern brain. They're quick, visual, shareable. They invite the viewer to become a detective in 10 seconds. No long reading required, no patience demanded, just a shiver of recognition and the intoxicating thought, what if? But photographs and film are also the cruelest kind of evidence. They offer clarity without context. They are honest about what they show and ambiguous about what it means. A person holding a small object near the face could be talking into a compact radio, adjusting a hearing aid, shading their eyes, covering their mouth against wind, or simply fidgeting. The angles of early cameras flatten depth. The grain erases detail. A dark shape becomes a modern device because our minds are trained to see modern devices everywhere. We carry them all day. We dream them at night. They sit like an extension of our hands. Of course, we recognize them in the past. Recognition is what the brain is built to do. And yet, it isn't only the object that unsettles. It's the feeling of familiarity crossing time like a beam of light. Because when you see someone in 1928 move with a gesture that belongs to your own life, you feel history shrink. The decades collapse. The dead seem briefly alive in a way that is almost too intimate. The past stops being then and starts being now, but different. This is where the story becomes less about gadgets and more about perception. The internet era has made us hungry for anomalies and also remarkably vulnerable to them. We scroll through images at speed, forming conclusions faster than we can question them. We read the past with modern eyes, and those eyes are not neutral. They are coated in expectation. But there's a deeper reason these wrong objects, in old footage, continue to seduce us. They offer a fantasy that comforts and disturbs at the same time, that someone long ago had access to what we have, that technology does not belong to us alone, that the future is not strictly in front of the past. In some versions of the story, the person in the image becomes a time traveler, casually blending into history with a device that hasn't been invented yet. It's a lovely idea, quiet, non-violent, almost tender. The traveler isn't changing wars or winning fortunes. They're simply present, observing, perhaps calling home. But if we step back, there's an even more human interpretation. These images may not show time travelers at all. They may show us, our modern selves, projected backward. A kind of cultural echo. The way our technology changes not only how we live, but how we interpret everything that came before. We retrofit history into our own vocabulary because our vocabulary feels like reality. So the real question becomes, when we look at the past, are we seeing what was there or what we can't stop expecting? Sometimes the strangest time machine isn't a device. It's the lens of the present. If a single ambiguous object can make us rewrite an entire scene, then how many of our certainties about history are built on the same fragile act of interpretation? There are moments when a story becomes too perfect. A time traveler appears with an anachronistic object. He leaves behind evidence. Someone investigates. The records line up. The mystery tightens like a knot. The ending arrives with just enough tragedy to make it feel real. And that is precisely when we should be most careful. Because the human mind is not only drawn to mystery, it's drawn to shape. It wants narratives that close, that click into place, that offer the satisfaction of coherence. We don't merely tell stories, we polish them until they shine. So in this chapter, we step into the uncomfortable but essential role of the skeptic, not the cynic who laughs, the skeptic who listens, then asks what the story is made of. Many famous time travel cases share a similar path. They begin as rumors or anecdotes, often circulating for years without clear sourcing. Then they appear in print, framed as true. The printed version gives the story weight. It becomes documented. Later, writers quote the earlier source, and the repetition hardens into something that looks like evidence. The myth becomes self-supporting. Sometimes, if you trace the thread far enough back, you find a strange and quiet truth. The story began as fiction. This doesn't ruin it. In a way, it deepens it, because the fact that a narrative can escape its fictional birthplace and become real in public memory tells us something profound about how modern culture works. We are surrounded by information. We are exhausted by it. We long for the kind of story that cuts through the noise and makes the world feel charged again. A convincing myth doesn't need to be true to function. It only needs to feel true. That feeling often comes from specificity, names, dates, addresses. These details act like anchors, holding the tale steady in the mind. But anchors can be forged. A good storyteller knows that reality is built from particulars, so they provide particulars, and the audience supplies belief. There's also a darker mechanism at play, the way uncertainty fuels attachment. When a story is unresolved, it remains alive. It invites participation. People debate it, retell it, add new findings, create diagrams, post research threads. The myth becomes a living organism sustained by attention. This is not a flaw in human nature. It's a feature. It's how we make meaning together. And yet, the temptation remains. If a story isn't literally true, we feel we've wasted our wonder, as if awe must be justified by fact. But wonder is not a finite resource, and skepticism does not have to kill it. Skepticism can refine wonder into something sturdier. It helps us separate the emotional truth of a narrative from the claim that it happened exactly as described. Consider what the time traveler myth is trying to express, even when it is fabricated. It expresses the vulnerability of the present, our sense that the world is shifting too fast. It expresses the desire for hidden order, an idea that time is not just chaos, but a structure we might, someday, understand. It expresses the loneliness of modern life, our hunger for connection across distance, across eras, across death. In other words, even a hoax can carry a sincere human message. The challenge is to hold both truths at once. A story can be false in detail and still reveal something true about us. And there's another twist. Sometimes the act of debunking becomes its own kind of story. It can turn into a performance of superiority, a way to feel safe by insisting the world contains no anomalies at all. But the universe has never promised to be safe. It has only promised to be consistent enough for us to build lives inside it. So we walk a narrow bridge. On one side, gullibility, on the other, contempt. The bridge itself is curiosity, paired with humility. In the next chapter, we'll return to people again. Not anonymous figures in crowds, not nameless legends, but a traveler with a name carved into history. Someone who claimed to have stepped into the future, walked its streets, and returned with an account that still reads like a dream trying to become a report. If a story's origins can blur so easily, then what does it take for any account, whether miraculous or mundane, to earn our trust? It's always the ordinary moments that make these stories hard to forget. Not lightning storms, not secret laboratories, not men in dark suits, a leaking pipe, a cramped apartment, a hand reaching behind a sink. In August of 2006, in a Swedish town where most days pass with the quiet predictability of routine, a man named Håkan Nordqvist claimed he found something impossible inside his own home. He wasn't hiking in remote wilderness. He wasn't exploring ruins. He was renovating a kitchen. The way the story is told, it begins with irritation. A small water problem, the kind that makes you kneel on tile and curse under your breath. He reached into a tight space behind the plumbing, expecting damp wood, plaster, the resistance of a wall. Instead, his hand kept going. There are a few seconds in every uncanny account when the teller describes the moment disbelief becomes physical. The body registers it first. The skin expects friction and meets emptiness. The mind tries to correct the sensation. Maybe a gap, maybe a loose panel, maybe the angle is wrong. But the emptiness remained. Nordqvist claimed he widened the space and discovered what felt like a tunnel, narrow and claustrophobic, leading into darkness that didn't behave like a normal cavity inside a building. He described crawling, the air changing, the sense that he was moving somewhere the blueprint of his apartment did not allow. And then, according to his account, he emerged into his own apartment again, only it wasn't his. The layout matched, but the room carried the unmistakable fingerprint of another era. The decor was unfamiliar. The light felt different. Objects sat where he would never have placed them. Technology was present in forms that were almost recognizable, yet undeniably advanced. Screens that responded with a casual intelligence, appliances that seemed quieter and more integrated than anything common in 2006. A home that felt lived in, but updated in ways his imagination couldn't fully supply. Most unsettling of all, he claimed he wasn't alone. In a chair sat an elderly man, watching something on a screen, with the relaxed posture of someone who belongs in the room. The two men looked at each other, and Nordqvist felt the kind of dread that arrives not from danger, but from familiarity, twisted into something wrong. The older man, he believed, was himself. The story's details vary depending on who retells it, but one element remains central: evidence. Nordqvist claimed that he returned through the tunnel carrying proof that could not be dismissed as a simple dream. A photograph, one that seemed to show him alongside an older version of himself, and a tattoo newly present, bearing information that appeared to predate its own existence in his life. This is where time travel stories become both compelling and fragile. They hinge on objects: a photo, a mark on skin, a device out of place. Physical things feel like anchors in a sea of uncertainty. Yet in the modern world, anchors can be forged, photos can be manipulated, stories can be staged. Even a tattoo can be explained away by mundane means, unless it carries something verifiable that the person could not have known. And still, something about the setting keeps pulling the listener back. A kitchen, a private space, no audience or performance. If Nordqvist invented the story, why choose a leak behind a sink as the portal? Why not a more dramatic entrance? Unless the point was not drama, but plausibility, the way reality tends to deliver strangeness quietly without a soundtrack. There is also a psychological truth threaded through his account: the fear of meeting yourself at the far end of life. Not in the abstract, but face to face. It's a confrontation with time's most intimate fact: that we are all traveling forward, whether we consent or not. The future isn't an idea. It's a version of us waiting to be born. So what are we to do with a story like this? We can treat it as a hoax. We can treat it as a hallucination shaped by stress and suggestion. Or we can treat it as a parable wearing the costume of a true event, a modern folk tale about how thin the walls can feel between who we are and who we might become. And yet, even if it is only a tale, it leaves behind a question that lingers like water stains on drywall. If you could crawl through a narrow passage and meet your future self, would you want to? Or would you be afraid that the person waiting there would recognize you more clearly than you recognize yourself? Every era has its favored kind of traveler. The early 20th century imagined travelers as inventors, men surrounded by brass and steam, turning the future into something you could bolt together. The late 20th century imagined them as rebels, outsiders, breaking rules, slipping through cracks in authority. But the digital age prefers a different figure entirely: the accidental witness, someone who didn't ask for the extraordinary, didn't hunt it, didn't profit from it, someone who simply looked up at the wrong moment and saw time behaving strangely. These are the stories that spread like sparks, not because they're proven, but because they're emotionally legible. They feel like something that could happen to you. And in that sense, time travelers are not always characters. They are roles we can inhabit for a moment. The person who sees something out of place becomes, briefly, the only one who knows the world is more porous than it appears. But the digital age does something else too. It changes what counts as evidence. In previous centuries, evidence lived in institutions: archives, libraries, police files, museum drawers. Today, evidence lives in the hands of strangers. It lives in shaky video clips, in photos shared without provenance, in screenshots that multiply faster than anyone can verify them. The result is a kind of crowded courtroom where everyone speaks at once, and the judge is an algorithm. This is where the question of time travel becomes strangely entangled with the question of trust. Because if you can't trust what you see, then the future feels less like a destination and more like a threat. And when the present feels unstable, people reach for narratives that explain instability as something bigger than chaos. Time travel stories do exactly that. They say, The reason reality feels strange is because reality is strange. There's comfort in that, even when it scares us. But comfort has a cost. Once a story becomes popular enough, it attracts imitation. Hoaxes breed hoaxes. Genuine mysteries, if they exist, are drowned in a sea of manufactured ones. The signal is lost in the noise. So how do we keep our curiosity intact without letting it be hijacked? One way is to look for the human fingerprints that don't benefit from deception. Not just proof, but pattern. What does the storyteller gain? What do they risk? Do they invite scrutiny or dodge it? Do they speak in vague atmospheres or commit to verifiable detail? Do they build a brand around the claim or quietly let it fade? Yet even this isn't foolproof. People lie for reasons that aren't financial. They lie for attention, for identity, for the thrill of control. And sometimes people tell stories they believe because the mind under pressure can rearrange reality with astonishing sincerity. Still, among the noise, there remains a persistent category of time travel tale that feels older than the internet and stranger than simple hoaxing. The missing time story. A person leaves work. A person drives home. A person walks down a street they've known for years. And somewhere along the way, time goes soft. Minutes become hours. A route becomes unfamiliar. The sky looks wrong. The radio hisses with static. They arrive somewhere they can't explain. And when they return, if they return, something has shifted. Not necessarily the world, but the feeling of the world, like the fabric has been tugged and never fully lies flat again. These stories rarely come with gadgets. They come with emotion, confusion, fear, a quiet grief that language can't hold. That grief is important. It suggests the storyteller isn't selling wonder. They're trying to name an experience that made them feel small. Which brings us to the next kind of traveler, the one who doesn't claim to come from the future, but who claims to have been stolen by it for a while. A case where a person insisted they stepped forward in time, looked around, and came back not with a machine, but with memories. Memories that aged them in a way their body didn't. If time can slip under your feet like loose gravel, then what does it mean to call any day normal? In 1896, a man stepped into a New York streetcar and claimed he had just returned from the year 2100. His name, in the accounts that survive, was Charles, or sometimes Charlie, and that small inconsistency is the first warning light. Time travel stories rarely arrive with clean paperwork. They arrive like overheard conversations, copied and recopied until the edges blur. Still, the scene holds. A city at the end of the 19th century. Horses and electricity sharing the same streets. Factories exhaling smoke. Newspapers fat with ink and certainty. And in the middle of it all, one man insisting he had seen what comes next. He described a future New York with buildings taller than anything his listeners could picture, streets transformed, and a skyline that looked in his telling like a forest of stone and glass. He spoke of technology that made distance feel trivial. He spoke of people moving with a different kind of ease, as if the city itself had learned new habits. And then he did something that made the story linger. He gave an address. He claimed that in the year 2100, he lived at a certain location, and that those who doubted him could verify it, if not now, then someday. It's a strange kind of confidence, almost tender. A man offering the future as a receipt. Of course, we can't verify it, not in any satisfying way. We can compare maps, examine how neighborhoods changed, note how street numbering shifts over time. But the deeper problem remains. A prediction framed as a memory is slippery. Even if the details align with future reality, it could be luck, intuition, or the natural trajectory of urban growth. Cities tend to build upward. Technology tends to shrink. People tend to mistake direction for destiny. So if we can't treat the account as proof, why hold it at all? Because stories like this reveal the moment when modernity itself began to feel like time travel. Imagine being alive in 1896. The world is already accelerating. The telephone exists, but it still feels like magic. The camera steals faces into paper. Electric light pushes back night. Factories produce objects faster than hands ever could. The old rhythms of life, season, sun, muscle, are being replaced by a new rhythm: speed. In that context, claiming to have visited 2100 is less like inventing the impossible and more like giving voice to a fear that was already in the air, that the future was coming too fast and that ordinary people might be left behind. The traveler's account becomes a pressure valve, a way to talk about the strange new century approaching without having to admit how little control anyone had over it. There's another human layer too. When someone says, "I've been to the future," they are often also saying, "I've been somewhere you haven't, and I returned." It's a claim to significance in a world that can make individuals feel invisible. The traveler becomes special not through wealth or power, but through experience. And yet, the sadness hidden in such claims is easy to miss. If he truly believed his story, then he was carrying a private burden. Memories of a world no one else could see. Impressions that would fade as he tried to translate them into language that didn't exist yet. Anyone who has tried to describe a dream knows the feeling, how the more you talk, the more it slips away. Whether Charles was a prankster, a troubled mind, a journalist's invention, or something stranger, his story leaves us with a question that is surprisingly modern. If the future is simply the present with new clothes, what do we gain by imagining it as a distant country we can visit? And what does it cost us, emotionally, to live in an era where the future already feels like it has arrived without our permission? There's a particular kind of mystery that doesn't live in grand predictions or public accidents. It lives in the small humiliations of daily life, standing in line, losing your train of thought, forgetting why you walked into a room. It lives in the quiet panic of realizing you can't account for a stretch of time. We call it missing time, and the phrase itself carries a chill. Not because the hours are gone, hours pass whether we watch them or not, but because the self is missing from its own story. You can lose your keys and laugh. You can lose a day and feel your reality loosen. Across many accounts, the pattern repeats with eerie familiarity. A person drives a route they know. They glance at the clock. They look up again, and the sun has shifted too far. They arrive at a destination without remembering the road between. The radio has changed stations. The phone shows calls they don't recall making. Their clothes smell of rain, even though the weather was clear. Sometimes the experience includes a sense of dislocation so specific it becomes almost cinematic. A road that looks wrong, a town too quiet, a sky with a color that doesn't match the season. These details could be symptoms of fatigue, stress, or the mind's tendency to decorate gaps. Yet the emotional aftermath is consistent, the feeling that something happened and that the mind has sealed it away like a wound. If time travel exists at all, this is where it would hide, in the places where memory is weakest and the human mind is least able to prove what occurred. And that is precisely why the stories are so difficult to handle ethically. It is easy to exploit them. It is easy to turn them into sensational entertainment. But if we approach them with care, they offer something more meaningful than a cheap thrill. They offer a portrait of human fragility. The brain, under certain conditions, can produce time loss. Sleep deprivation can cause microsleeps. Trauma can trigger dissociation. Medical conditions can create blackouts. Even extreme boredom or stress can blur hours into a smear. These explanations are not insulting. They are reminders that consciousness is a living process, not a flawless recording device. But here's the strange part. Even when we accept these explanations, the stories still feel haunting, because whether the gap was caused by biology or something beyond it, the gap feels the same from the inside. It is the sensation of being absent from your own existence. Time travel myths often promise control. Go back, fix it, return. Missing time stories promise the opposite, that time can take you, and you may not remember where you went. This fear is older than modern science. Ancient cultures imagined people stolen by gods, lured into forests, taken into dream realms. Today, we frame the same fear in modern language. Time slips, glitches, anomalies. The costume changes, the emotion remains, and in that emotion, there is also a quiet yearning. Because part of us wants to believe time is not a locked door, that there are hidden corridors, that reality has more rooms than the ones we've been shown. We are creatures who feel imprisoned by the calendar. We measure our lives in deadlines, anniversaries, and aging. We feel time as pressure, so the idea that time might be flexible, sometimes cruelly, sometimes wondrously, keeps returning. In the next story, the traveler is neither a prophet nor a ghost in an old photograph. He is a man who appeared in a place he shouldn't exist, with language and documents that didn't match any map, leaving authorities to decide whether they were facing a fraud, a foreigner, or something far stranger. A case that has become a symbol of the most unsettling possibility of all, not traveling to the future, but arriving from a world that runs parallel to our own. If you can't account for your own hours, how firmly do you truly hold the story of your life? And what happens when the narrative breaks? Imagine a busy airport in the middle of the 20th century. The fluorescent lights, the clipped announcements, the smell of cigarette smoke that back then still clung to public spaces. Passports checked by hand, currency exchanged at counters with glass windows, a world already modern but not yet frictionless. Into that world, a man arrives who appears ordinary at first, well-dressed, calm, carrying himself like someone who has traveled before. He presents a passport. The officials glance at it and pause. The document, they say, is from a country that doesn't exist. The name on the passport is Taured, and according to the legend, the man speaks confidently about it as if everyone should know it. He insists his nation has existed for over 1,000 years. He points to its location on a map, somewhere between France and Spain, where we know Andorra sits. He seems confused that the map doesn't reflect what he knows. Authorities, unsettled, escort him away for questioning. They search his luggage. Everything inside looks plausible. Business papers, currency, travel stamps, except the origin story doesn't fit the world as they understand it. In some retellings, the mystery deepens. He has stamps showing previous travel, implying this is not his first trip into our reality. A company name in his documents checks out, but the address doesn't exist in the form he describes. His money appears legitimate but unfamiliar. Then comes the part that turns the story from odd to unforgettable. The man is placed in a hotel room under guard, pending investigation. The room is on an upper floor. The windows are sealed. The door is watched. And yet, by morning, the man is gone. No signs of escape, no broken glass, no bribed guard, at least in the story's cleanest versions. He simply vanishes, as if the world corrected an error and quietly removed the evidence. If you're listening carefully, you can hear the craftsmanship of myth here. An impossible document, a map contradiction, a locked room, a disappearance. The narrative is built like a classic mystery, designed to leave the listener with the delicious frustration of no solution. And still, it survives. Because the man from Taured's story isn't really about passports. It's about parallel worlds, the idea that reality might be one version among many, and that sometimes the borders between them don't behave the way we assume. This idea has a modern scientific cousin in theories of branching timelines and multiple universes. But the emotional version is older, buried deep in folklore, the traveler who wanders into the wrong kingdom, the sailor who lands on a shore that isn't on any chart, the hunter who returns to his village to find everyone changed. The modern airport is simply a new stage for an ancient anxiety. That identity depends on shared agreement. Your name matters because it matches records. Your country matters because it appears on maps. If those systems fail, if you arrive with truth that doesn't align with the world's databases, you become a kind of ghost, not because you're dead, but because you don't match the story everyone else is telling. That's what makes the Taured tale so psychologically sharp. It threatens the fragile infrastructure of modern certainty. We trust our reality because it is corroborated, because other people see what we see, because institutions confirm it with stamps and ledgers. The Taured traveler is terrifying not because he might be a time traveler, but because he might be evidence that reality has versions. And yet, once we step into skepticism again, we notice the usual issues. The story is hard to source reliably. Details change depending on the teller. The location shifts. The dates drift. It becomes difficult to separate original account from later embellishment. But even if the case is fictional, it still functions like a dream that reveals something true. We fear becoming unintelligible to the world. We fear that our place in reality is conditional. So whether the man was real, mistaken, or invented, his story leaves a quiet question in the room, like an unanswered passport control stamp. If reality is partly a shared agreement, then what happens when someone arrives carrying a different agreement? And who decides which world is real enough to keep? In the end, every time travel story asks the same question in a different accent. Not, can this happen? But, what does it mean if it did? We began with a blinking cursor and a stranger on the early internet, speaking with the plain confidence of someone reading from a manual. We walked into Times Square and watched a man die in the wrong century. We wandered the gardens of Versailles and felt the air thicken, as if history were not behind glass, but close enough to brush your sleeve. We held an ancient mechanism and realized the past could be more sophisticated than our pride prefers. We stared at old footage until our modern habits projected themselves backward, turning ambiguity into certainty. We crawled through a kitchen's hidden gap and felt the terror of meeting ourselves at the far end of life. We followed rumors into airports and imagined the loneliness of arriving with the wrong map. Along the way, the stories kept offering two gifts at once: wonder and doubt. Wonder makes life larger. Doubt keeps it honest. The modern world often encourages us to choose one, to become either a believer who never questions or a skeptic who never feels. But the most human stance lives between those poles. It says, I don't know, but I'm paying attention. Because whether or not anyone has ever truly stepped outside the timeline, the deeper truth is undeniable. Time shapes us, and we are always trying to shape time back. We build calendars and clocks to tame it. We build archives to preserve what it takes. We build rituals to mark what it changes. Birthdays, funerals, anniversaries, the quiet private moments when we realize we are not the same person we were last year. And sometimes, in the pressure of that realization, we invent travelers. Not to deceive, but to cope. Not to escape reality, but to soften its hardest edges. A traveler suggests that time is negotiable, that endings might be revisited, that lost things might be found, that the future might already have answers waiting for us somewhere. Yet there is another reason these tales endure, and it's almost comforting in its simplicity. Time travel is the story we tell when we don't want to accept that life is unrepeatable. The past feels too precious to be locked away. The future feels too frightening to face blind. So we imagine doors, we imagine tunnels, we imagine devices with humming fields and impossible angles. We imagine that the universe might be kinder than the calendar, that it might allow us to step aside, look around, and return with clarity. But even if time travel remains unproven, the urge behind it is profoundly real. It is the urge to understand, to make meaning, to stand in the flow of time without being swept away by it. And perhaps that is the final revelation. The most consistent time traveler in all these stories is not a soldier from 2036 or a stranger from a vanished nation. It is the human mind. It travels backward every time you remember. It travels forward every time you imagine. It builds entire worlds out of fragments and calls them experience. It reaches across decades with a song, a photograph, a smell, a single sentence, whispered at the wrong moment. We may never build a machine that carries bodies through centuries, but we already carry ourselves through centuries in subtler ways. We inherit the fears of people who lived before us. We repeat their mistakes. We revive their ideas. We resurrect their art. We take their inventions, sometimes forgotten, sometimes rediscovered, and we continue the unfinished work of being human. So if you want to end this journey with a question worthy of the mystery, let it be this. What if the point of time travel isn't to escape time at all? What if it's to learn how to live inside it, awake, curious, compassionate, so that when the future arrives, we meet it not as strangers, but as people who remember what it cost to get here? Because in the end, the most haunting possibility isn't that time can break, it's that it never does, and that our one brief passage through it is all we will ever have. So what will you do with the minutes that are truly yours?